Welcome, and thank you for standing by. All participants are in listen-only mode for the duration of today's conference. Today's call is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn the call over to your host, Arlene Dow. Thank you. You may begin.
Thank you, Victoria and Devin from the U.S. Census Bureau for hosting our webinar. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us to kick off the 2022 LED webinar. Before I introduce our presenter, I am thrilled to invite all of you to the 2022 Local Employment Dynamics Partnership Virtual Workshop on April 5th through the 7th. This year's theme is Making Sense of Data in a New Era. We will be highlighting the work of our state labor market information partners and other data users through plenary sessions, and our keynote speaker is 2021 Nobel Memorial Prize for Economics co-recipient David Card. Please visit our website at lehd.ces.census.gov for more information, and I'll be sure to put the link for registration in the chat. On behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau and the Local Employment Dynamics Partnership, in collaboration with the Council for Community and Economic Research and the Labor Market Information Institute, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the first LED webinar of 2022, Initial Impact of COVID-19 on Travel, Tourism, Outdoor Recreation, varied widely across states and demographic groups, with my colleague, Lee Tucker. In this presentation, Lee shows how the U.S. Census Bureau's quarterly workforce indicators was used to examine how workers employed in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation across the country were affected by the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Data indicates that states with the largest COVID-19 outbreaks and those with the largest share of tourism jobs were disproportionately impacted at the start of the pandemic. Even workers who retained their jobs experienced earnings losses of up to 40%. Comparisons across demographic groups also showed that the reduction in earnings and employment in this industry were unreasonably suffered by women and younger employees. In addition, this study was also featured as an article in our America Count stories, and I'll be sure to put a link for that in the chat for your review. Lee Tucker is an economist in the Center for Economic Studies Longitudinal Employer Household Dynamics Research Group. His research interests include a range of topics such as domestic outsourcing, veterans labor market outcomes, the impacts of local labor market concentration, and the impacts of unionization. He helped the launch of the LEHD's Veteran Employment Outcomes data product, and he is currently focused on efforts to update and improve the production of the LEHD snapshot for researcher use. Lee joined the U.S. Census Bureau in 2018 upon completion of a PhD in economics from Boston University. He also holds a BA in economics from Carleton College, and he served as a staff economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors from 2012 through 2013. With that, I welcome Lee Tucker.
Thank you very much, Arlene, and thank you everyone for joining today. Again, my name is Lee Tucker, and this research on the impact of COVID-19 on travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation is joint with Matt Graham, Heath Hayward, Hubert Janicki, and Erica McIntarfer. And I should just begin by stating a standard disclaimer that the opinions and conclusions that I'll express in this presentation are those of myself and do not represent the views of the U.S. Census Bureau. All of the tables and figures that are going to be done here are using publicly available data from the LEHD's Quarterly Workforce Indicators, or QWI. For those of you who aren't familiar with QWI, it's fantastic. This is just giving you an inkling of some of the things that it can do. And you will be able to access the QWI Explorer. I've got a link for that at the end of the slides, and I'm sure that Arlene or someone else will drop that into the chat for you if you want to play around with some of these numbers yourself. So I want to start with just a quick background on this analysis and how this analysis came about. In March, I think, of 2021, LEHD researchers got an external request we'll just say a high-level external request for more information on the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically on these industries, travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation employment. This was related to potential legislative efforts, for example, to address the issues with these industries related to the pandemic. And this was basically a quick deadline turnaround request. And the reason I mention that is because I want, in part in this presentation, not only to show you some results, but to highlight some of the value of QWI for this type of analysis. These are the kinds of questions that I suspect those of you at LMI shops or think tanks, you deal with these kinds of things all the time. And we decided that QWI would be an ideal data product for this analysis for several reasons. First, it has quarterly frequency. That allowed us to do a fairly close analysis of the pandemic timeline. At that time, we only had data through the second quarter of 2020, which of course was the initial sort of set of lockdowns and so on during the pandemic. But this has since been updated through the 2021 Q1. There is some 2021 Q2 data. I don't know if that's publicly released yet, but I'm not using that here because we don't have all of the states. So this is up through 2021 Q1. But this quarterly frequency was really nice for this because, things happen fast. We needed fairly timely information. QWI also allows for a lot of stratification because it is using administrative data from the LEHD. We have a lot of statistical power that allows for simultaneous stratification by industry and geography, as well as demographics. And actually by all three, although the things that I will show you today are mostly stratified either by geography or by demographics. And then finally, QWI provides readily available tabulations. No need to go to the microdata. This allowed us to produce a rapid turnaround, meant that we didn't have to go through, for example, disclosure review board processes and so on, and allowed us to just get a quick answer to this question. So, this I think is a really nice illustration of some of the things that can be done with QWI. So as I said, the idea here was to ask what was the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation. And so the first question you might ask yourself is, well, how do we define travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation? And so what we started with was a set of 3-digit NAICS codes. And the reason for this is that QWI allows you to do analyses using the public tabulations at the 3-digit NAICS level. So we basically went through the set of industries, found the ones that we thought corresponded to travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation, made a couple of adjustments, and ultimately landed on the following sets of 7 3-digit NAICS industries. The first is air transportation, probably not surprising, then scenic and sightseeing transportation, performing arts, spectator sports and related industries, museums, historical sites and similar institutions, amusement, gambling, and recreation industries, accommodation, and food services and drinking places. Now, you might think about this, especially when it comes to food services. Well, of course, there are lots of types of eating at restaurants or other types of food service or drinking place activities that are not really associated with travel or tourism, and certainly not outdoor recreation. So what we decided to do was to take a percentage of 722 employment. And in particular, we used a percentage based on the percentage of non-722 employment in the economy that is associated with the first 6 industries on this list. So we essentially took an allocated share that we would think of as being associated with tourism. This gave us a, sort of an aggregate that we could aggregate up in order to look at both employment and average earnings. Since these are, QWI reports average earnings, we're able to take weighted averages based on the employment in each of these individual industries. This does correspond pretty closely to, some of you may be familiar with the fact that the Bureau of Economic Analysis has a satellite accounts definition for, I believe, outdoor recreation specifically, that is an amalgamation of industries. This is not exactly the same because we are only able to drill down to the 3-digit NAICS level with QWI. However, it does correspond pretty closely, and you can think of this as being a pretty comprehensive picture of travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation, employment, and earnings. So before we jump into results, I want to mention one more thing that's going to be very important in thinking through these results, and that is, what does it mean to be employed in a quarter? Well, some of you may know this. For those of you who don't, LEHD uses a number of different administrative sources, and in particular, QWI's individual employment records come from UI records that are provided to the Census Bureau by individual states through the LED partnership. And these UI records just include total earnings in each quarter for each worker at each covered job, right? So if I worked for 3 different jobs over the course of a quarter and I earned $10 in each, it would look like, if we were to just take all of the jobs in the quarter, like I was employed 3 times, although I may have worked one of those in January, one in February, and one in March, and never been employed at all 3 at the same time. So what we often want to do is just observe a stock of employment at a single point in time. So the way that QWI does this is to use a measure that is beginning of quarter employment. And so what we basically do is just say, look, you had positive earnings on one side of a quarterly boundary, and you had positive earnings on the other side of a quarterly boundary in those 2 adjacent quarters. So on the boundary of that quarter, for example, April 1st, 2020, we infer that you were employed on that date. And so this is going to matter because, of course, the pandemic in March and April and May moved very quickly. And so what we're going to be looking at is beginning of quarter employment, which means you're going to be looking at what did employment look like essentially on April 1st of 2020 for 2020 Q2, and then July 1st, and then October 1st. Is that right? Yeah. So, that's beginning of quarter employment. Average earnings, on the other hand, we don't try to somehow divide because we don't know exactly when you were employed during the quarter. So we're going to report our average earnings over the entire quarter for individuals who were employed at that beginning of the quarter boundary. These are employment and earnings concepts that you can access in the QWI Explorer. There is some additional explanation on there, but I wanted to mention this because it is going to matter in terms of the interpretation of these results, and it may be a little bit different from what you think about if you're used to working with, for example, survey microdata or other things along those lines. Okay, so now that we have that under our belts, I think we're ready to start talking about results. So this is going to have essentially 4 parts, 3 main parts and a quick conclusion. The first is just to talk about the baseline employment characteristics. Who is it that works in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation in the U.S. economy? Then we're going to talk about aggregate impacts on these industries and geographic trends in the impacts in these industries. And then we'll proceed to talking about demographic trends, breaking down by some of the demographic characteristics that are available in QWI. And then finally, we'll conclude briefly with sort of a summary of what we've learned. So, baseline employment characteristics. Who works in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation? Well, it turns out that on the order of 4 to 5% of individuals in the U.S. economy are employed in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation, but there is quite a bit of heterogeneity by state. So in this state-level map, which I apologize, this will be the prettiest map because this was fixed up by Heath, and the other ones were made to use updated data by me, so they'll look a little bit less pretty. You can see quite a bit of geographic heterogeneity here. In particular, there are some states, especially states in the Mountain West, that have high shares of employment in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation. Also, a couple of others that you might not be surprised to see as having high percentage shares, such as Nevada or Hawaii or Florida, for example. Certain sections of, for example, the Midwest have lower percentages in comparison. So there is a fair amount of geographic heterogeneity in where people who are working in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation are located. But now let's turn to talking about demographics of who it is that's working in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation. And here you can see a graph that shows ratios of employment by sex and age. And I want to just explain how to interpret this graph. So what this is the ratio of employment of the particular group that is listed on this bar to the overall amount of employment of groups. Of course, in some cases, groups are of different sizes. If we talk about racial groups, as you'll see on the next slide, some of them are large and some of them are small. So what we're essentially saying is how much more likely or less likely are you as a member of this group to be employed in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation than you are to be employed in other industries. Right? And so a 1 implies that you're equally likely to be employed in those two groups and therefore about proportionally employed in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation. A number greater than 1 implies that there are more people in this group, and a number less than 1 implies that there are fewer people in this group than you would expect if the distribution of employment was random. So what we can interpret from this is that women are about 5% more likely to be employed in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation than in other industries. Men are somewhat less likely to be employed in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation than in other industries. So employment does lean a bit towards women. Now, if we look by age, we see an even more dramatic impact, and this may not surprise some of you, that travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation disproportionately employ young people, ages 14 to 24. I've rolled up to, I believe, 8 age categories that you can see in QWI a bit just here to make the analysis a bit easier to interpret. What you see is about 40% more likely to be in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation than in other industries if you're 14 to 24, whereas you're somewhat less likely if you're sort of prime age, 25 to 54, and also somewhat less likely if 55 plus. When we break down use the same methodology on race and ethnicity, what we can see is that there are some race groups that have considerably higher probability of employment in these industries. In particular, Native Hawaiians or Pacific Islanders are the most likely demographic group here to be employed in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation, and that likely is also associated with the geographic distribution of individuals in this group, in particular in Hawaii. And you can see that in general, other minority racial groups are more likely across the board to be employed in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation, while white alone Americans are slightly less likely to be employed in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation. And then when we break down by ethnicity, you can also see that employment in these industries is somewhat disproportionately held by individuals who are Hispanic or Latino. So my takeaway from this is that there is a fairly broad scope of, pretty broad swath of the population, demographically speaking and geographically speaking, that is employed in these industries, but there are definitely significant concentrations, most notably among young people, Hispanics and Latinos, and Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. Okay, so now that we kind of have a sense of who it is that's working in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation, let's look a little bit at aggregate impacts and geographic trends. And this is sort of the headline graph that might not surprise you, but is still shocking in a way to look at. And that is that just shows that travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation employment declined rapidly between the first and second quarters of 2020, and that as of 2021 Q1, which is the most recent data here, that it had not really recovered at all. In fact, it had continued to decline. So if you take a look at the axis here, you can see that in 2020 Q1, there were about 5 million individuals employed in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation in all states for which QWI data are available. That had declined to about 4 million by April 1st of 2020. So that is a very, very rapid decline when you consider that the onset of the pandemic was really only in the last couple weeks of the first quarter of 2020. And that, again, is shocking, even though it is perhaps not surprising to all of us at this point. So moving forward, you can see that by the beginning of 2021, we were down to just over 3.5 million employees. So this really is a very striking drop over this period, and in particular, really no evidence of recovery in terms of overall employment. So now let's look at this geographically, and what you can see is that in the early stage of the pandemic, these declines were concentrated in the Northeast. And again, this is why I wanted to outline that the measure of employment that we're using here is beginning of quarter employment. This is really a snapshot of employment, the employment decline on April 1st of 2020. This is a year-over-year percentage decline. So you can see, for example, that in the most affected state here, which was Vermont, the decline in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation employment was on the order of about 43 or 44%. It was just under 40% for several other states, all in the Northeast, and in the 30% plus range for several more states, all in the Northeast. This again tracks the early stages of the pandemic outbreak in the Northeast. But what it turns out that we see, and again, these are relatively new results because we just updated these for subsequent quarters, is that over time, this decline in employment spread across the country. So it's not something necessarily specific to the Northeast. You can see here 2020 Q2 in the top left, 2020 Q3 in the top right, 2020 Q4 in the bottom left, and 2021 Q1 in the bottom right. And so what you can see is that actually, in general, these are all on the same scale, I should mention. So by the worst disemployment effects within states year over year were generally felt in the third quarter of 2020, and there was a bit of a rebound. But this, basically not a substantial one, but basically what you see is that pretty much across the board, by the third or fourth quarter of 2020, you're looking at, in most places, employment declines of 20% or more. In some cases, up to 50 or 60% declines in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation employment. Again, by the first quarter of 2021, you start to see a little bit of a rebound. Again, these are year-over-year percentage declines, so this is attempting to net out any sort of seasonality that we might be concerned about, which certainly matters at the state level as well. So you can see there are some states for which employment declines are still in that 40 to 60% range, notably, California, New York, Massachusetts, and my current locale of the District of Columbia. But in contrast, the employment declines are actually only on the order of 5, 10, or maybe 15% in some of the upper mountain west states. So there is quite a lot of heterogeneity as of the beginning of 2021, but certainly in comparison to that 2020 Q2 graph, this decline did spread across the country as the pandemic itself spread across the country. Now, this is the interesting finding that you might not have expected, and that is that average earnings in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation have actually recovered rapidly. You can see here, these are nominal dollars, so these are not adjusted for inflation. You can see here the red line is 2020 Q2, that there was a very sharp decline in average quarterly earnings between the first and second quarters of 2020, but by the fourth quarter of 2020, by the third quarter of 2020, this had basically been erased, and by the fourth quarter of 2020, average earnings were actually substantially above those before the pandemic. And this is really obviously very much in contrast to those employment results. And what this suggests, and we'll get into this a little bit more, is that there was a lot of reduction in employment, and most of that reduction in employment occurred among individuals who were lower earners. Essentially, the sort of left tail of the earnings distribution left the industry, either to unemployment or to switch to another industry, or to leave the labor force entirely. And so the individuals who remained actually had higher average earnings, or at least similar average earnings to what they had before the pandemic. So now I've got a similar set of state-level maps here that track this over the 4 quarters throughout the country. And what you can see, orange here corresponds to declines in average earnings. And obviously, fairly clear that in 2020 Q2, most states are fairly deep shades of orange. In particular, some of the states that were hardest hit at the initial stage of the pandemic include some of those states that were most reliant on travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation as a share of their employment, such as Nevada, the District of Columbia, and Hawaii. And you can see that there were earnings declines on the order of up to 43%, I believe, in the case of Nevada, in these industries. So huge declines in average earnings that occurred very rapidly. Again, this is unlike the employment data. These are earnings over the entire course of the quarter, but for individuals who were employed on April 1st. As we move through time here, you can see in 2020 Q3 or by 2020 Q3, most states had rebounded entirely and actually were reporting small increases or in some cases somewhat larger increases in average earnings. You see the same pattern in 2020 Q4 and by 2020 Q1, things have sort of leveled out, and what you can see is that most states, the vast majority of states, are reporting either a 0 to 10% increase in travel and tourism or average earnings or a 0 to 10% decrease in travel and tourism average earnings. Essentially, though there was a huge employment adjustment, by the first quarter of 2021, earnings had more or less returned, average earnings had more or less returned to what they were before the pandemic, and were in fact modestly higher in most states. So with that, we'll now turn to demographic trends. And I'm just going to show you this by those same demographic groups that we talked about before. So this graph shows employment and average earnings by sex. And what you can see here in the green series, both for employment and for average earnings are males, and the blue series are employment and average earnings for females. What you can see is the same pattern that we saw in the aggregate data, where both earnings and employment went down between the first and second quarters of 2020, and the average earnings rebounded, although employment did not rebound for either demographic group. However, what you also see is that in 2020 Q1, these lines are basically all right on top of each other, right? A percentage, year-over-year percentage change was slightly positive, right? As you might expect, just a slight increase in nominal earnings and a slight increase in employment. But over the course of the pandemic, in fact, almost immediately, but even consistently over the course of the pandemic, women had larger employment declines than men, and they had larger decreases and then smaller increases in average earnings. And I want to just point out that these are not, these are within group, right? So this is earnings of women, average earnings of women in this industry relative to average earnings of women in this industry in the prior year. So I showed you some slides that showed that women are disproportionately employed in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation, right? So this is saying that, not just is it the case that they are more impacted because there are more of them in these industries, but the folks who remained in these industries, fewer of those folks, women remained in these industries, and those who remained in these industries had smaller earnings gains. So this is sort of on top of that disproportionate employment. Now, I'm going to turn to age group, and you'll see the same sorts of setup here, except for with the 3 age groups that we talked about before. And so what I'm going to refer to as prime age individuals, ages 25 to 54, who we tend to think of as being in sort of the prime of their working years, are in the thicker blue lines, and then the green lines correspond to young individuals, and the orange lines correspond to older individuals. And what you can see here is that there's also quite a bit of heterogeneity, but it's not quite as clear. Interestingly, what we see is that the employment declines were largest for young people and remain largest for young people, and employment declines were smallest for older people. And sort of a clear age gradient. But when we look at average earnings, we don't see the same sort of thing. We see that both young people and older people had small increases, or even by 2021 Q1, small decreases in average earnings as the pandemic sort of continued. But individuals who were sort of in those prime age years had the largest average earnings increases. So this, again, suggests sort of a shift to less employment, but employment by individuals who are perhaps more likely to be higher earners in the first place, and higher earnings for those individuals. Then we shift to ethnicity, and what we can see here is, again, a very similar pattern. We see here individuals who are Hispanic or Latino are reported in the thicker blue line, and in the green line is individuals who are not Hispanic or Latino. And we see that Hispanics and Latinos had larger declines in employment throughout the pandemic and have had smaller increases, or in fact decreases, in average earnings relative to individuals who are not Hispanic or Latino. This, again, is of any race, categorized separately from race groups in QWI. But this is, again, consistent with the sort of pattern that we saw before about individuals who may have had lower earnings ex ante having more negative shocks ex post. I think there was something else I was going to mention with this, but okay, I think we've got that. And then finally, we'll talk about employment changes by race. And for this, because there are 6 groups, I'm going to use a slightly different format. I'm only going to show you 2 quarters, and I'm only going to show you employment. If we were to look at average earnings, it's a bit mixed. There's not a really clear gradient or a clear pattern across the 6 groups. They, switch orders over time a bit. But in employment, there is a more clear pattern. And what you can see here is that in 2020 Q2, which is the green series, there were some differences in the year-over-year percentage change in employment. This is, there is some heterogeneity. Native Hawaiians or Pacific Islanders had smaller declines, for example. However, I do want to point out that because this is beginning of quarter employment, this is a snapshot of a point very early in the pandemic when we know that the decline in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation employment had not really spread throughout the country entirely. So some of these differences may be driven by just geographic differences in where individuals of these racial groups reside. But if we look forward to 2021 Q1, what we do start to see is a little bit more clear of a pattern in which white individuals had the smallest declines, percentage declines in employment, although they are still very large at nearly 30%, but Black or African American individuals in particular, and also the other racial groups, had larger employment declines. And you can see there that the percentage decline in employment for individuals who are Black or African American in travel and tourism was close to 40%. So again, very large declines in employment that do span across demographic groups, unquestionably, but still quite a bit of heterogeneity. And again, heterogeneity that suggests some sort of selection in who remained employed in this industry and who did not remain employed in this industry. So a few conclusions here. This is mostly just going to restate things that I just told you, but earnings and employment in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation both declined substantially at the onset of the pandemic. However, average earnings have appeared to have essentially fully rebounded, right? And that suggests that the set of individuals who remain employed in this industry has changed, and also suggests, that the individuals who left the industry had or whose earnings, were lost as a result of this, may have or do have the most negative outcomes. So the next bullet point I want to point out here is just and remind you that early geographic patterns did follow the spread of the pandemic, but these effects of disemployment and effects on earnings on travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation have become more widespread over time. There's really still a fair amount of heterogeneity by the beginning of 2021 in the employment impacts, but actually very little, comparatively speaking, heterogeneity in average earnings impacts by the time we get to early 2021. Women, young people, and racial and ethnic minority groups in these industries have continued to be disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. In terms of next steps in thinking about this, of course, this is something that we are interested in continuing to analyze over time, and the researchers on this project are looking at this. But this really suggests, an important future direction that is already the subject of some ongoing research within LEHD, which is just how can we best track cohorts of impacted workers over time, in particular as they change industries. What we see in these data are, for example, the average earnings of the people who stayed in this industry. But when the decline in an industry is so pronounced, what we may actually care about is where did those folks go, right? Where did they go? Where did they end up permanently? What do their earnings look like permanently? And we do have some other data products, such as the job-to-job flows data product, that do start to answer this question. But there is continued research into thinking about how can we in QWI and in general provide publicly available, readily accessible, easy to use, and useful statistics that tell us something about, did these folks leave employment entirely? Did they switch to other industries? What do their earnings trajectories look like? And so on. And as you can see, for many individuals in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation, and in particular for women, young people, and some of these racial and ethnic minority groups, it is particularly salient because it appears that they have, in many cases, left the industry entirely. So I think that is all that I have to say for today, but I am looking forward to answering any questions that you may have. You can see my contact information right here. I welcome your emails, and I've also included links, which I think Erlene will drop into the chat, for the QWI Explorer, where you can explore some of these data yourself. These were not produced directly on the QWI Explorer only because we needed to aggregate up industries, as you saw, but all of these data can be played with and actually downloaded via the QWI Explorer website, and also the America Counts brief, which does cover most of the same ground here, with the exception that at the time that was produced, we only had data through 2020 Q2, and I've now been able to give you a bit of a more updated picture of what we've seen going on with travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation. So with that, I think I will turn it back to Erlene or to whomever it is that is fielding the questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Lee. So at this time, if you have any questions for Lee, please add them to the Q&A box, and we will address them as they come in. We've had questions regarding the recordings and slides, which will be available at our census.gov/academy. And Victoria and Devin have added the link to the chat. So the first question I have is, what was the tourism percentage you came up with for 722?
I would have to check on exactly what that number was. But it is, like I said, it's basically you take total employment, subtract out 722 employment, so it's not in the total numerator and denominator, and then we took the sum of those 6 industries' employment and divided by that number, total minus 722 as the denominator. It's approximately, I'm going to say 4.5 or 5%, but I don't recall the exact number off the top of my head. But it is definitely something you could do directly with the data downloaded from QWI. And I will say that we used as a baseline for all of this 2019 Q2, because that is, there was the initial analysis was just 2019 versus 2020. So we just kept that as the baseline for the rest of this analysis here.
All right, another question is just wondering why cruise industry that actually cater for pleasure and or tourism travel as compared to air transportation was not included in the 7 identified industries. Thank you.
Of course, that's a great question. And the answer is that unfortunately, QWI does provide stratification at the 3-digit NAICS sector level. I remember looking at this, and I believe that, if I've got this correctly, that there is a boat transportation category that is a 3-digit NAICS sector, and that cruises are a 5 or 6-digit NAICS underneath that. So basically, we couldn't separate cruises from, for example, cargo boat transportation or passenger ferries or other types of boat transportation that were potentially not really travel tourism and outdoor recreation. And we didn't have a great way to allocate it given the turnaround, so we didn't conclude it. But I certainly think that, that's right. I mean, we're taking our best stab at how do you aggregate up travel tourism and outdoor recreation. I think that in terms of percentages, this is certainly in the right ballpark, the right order of magnitude, but are there some types of employment that we might think of as being travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation that wouldn't fall under this? Certainly, and are there some types of employment that might fall under this that might, not be entirely tourists or entirely outdoors? Certainly that also, but this, provides us a pretty good benchmark, I believe.
Great. Here's another question. I don't see a change in slides from average earnings in travel tourism.
Okay, so I'm going to make sure I understand here. So let's pull up. You don't see a change in slides from average earnings in travel and tourism.
In travel tourism.
I'm not sure I understand what's meant by a change in slides. Maybe the person can clarify?
Yes, maybe if you'd like, you can add your question, and then we'll find that one. So we'll come back to that one. Another question is, how much did the struggles with childcare and virtual schooling during the last part of the 2019-2020 school year affect these industries?
That is a great question. We have not tried to analyze this directly. I think that it is something that I would like to see more research on. However, I think that, what we can definitely see, I mean, it seems likely, although we don't know for sure, that some of this heterogeneity in employment, in particular by sex, is potentially not entirely driven by sort of the employer side, but is driven by the labor force participation decisions of individuals. We think that's probably the case for all of these to some extent, but because it is, there is plenty of statistical evidence suggesting that childcare is disproportionately done by women in the U.S., I think that it is likely that some of this difference in employment could be associated with that. But and that may be true for some of the other demographic groups as well. But specifically tying it to childcare, or specifically tying any of these statistics to childcare, isn't something that we have tried to do. I imagine you could use geographic information about the number of children or other things. If you had the microdata, the LAHC microdata by itself does not include information about household structure, although there is information in things like the ACS, or the ACS microdata would probably be, if you're working with public data, the place that I would go to try to answer this question. Or if you had access to restricted use microdata, then it is, there's information in the decennial and so on, and that might be able to link something to household structure to get into this more. But in terms of what we can do with the publicly available data, certainly with QWI, we're not really equipped to be able to answer that question directly.
Okay, next question is, can you please explain why this analysis was done at the 3-digit NAICS level when I believe QWI provides data at the 4-digit NAICS?
Yes, it's been a while since I've looked at this specifically, but there are some 4-digit pieces of information in QWI, but I believe, if I recall correctly, that either the demographic or geographic tabulations cannot be done simultaneously with industry level tabulations at the 4-digit level. I don't recall I don't recall which of those it is, but I believe that was essentially the constraint. Because I think had we been able to go deeper down, we would have certainly liked to do so. In particular, we would have liked to bring in cruise transportation, as that person pointed out. That was something that we also thought of and also recognized as a limitation. But if I recall correctly, QWI allows some stratifications at the 4-digit level, but a more comprehensive set at the 3-digit level.
Great. And next, this is more of a comment. It said, don't forget wonderful LED extraction tool. So thank you for that.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Actually, this was not done, the final version of this was not done using the LED extraction tool, but the initial version of this actually was done using exactly an extract from that tool. So I definitely recommend everyone to check it out because it is what allowed us to do this.
Here's another one. Have you done a similar analysis based on educational status?
We have not done an analysis based on educational status. It was not as much in our remit at that time, and it has not been added to this, but I think it's a good idea to do it. In fact, I'm going to write it down because it would not be a difficult thing to add, although we would need to pull a new extract in order to do so. I believe there is some data elsewhere that says that employment in travel tourism and outdoor recreation is disproportionately individuals with lower levels of education, but I don't have an exact any exact data on that. And then in terms of the impacts and the heterogeneity impacts, I would be very interested to see if it follows this same pattern of, the expectation would be, just looking at these, that perhaps individuals with more education were less likely to leave employment in this industry and perhaps have larger average earnings gains. But again, we haven't looked at it directly.
Thank you. So next question is, some states had a YOY decline in average earners in 2021 Q1, while most rebounded. Any insight into why?
No, hang on. Oops, I left the slideshow. Hold on one moment. I don't know. I went to go to that and I clicked too far. Can people see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I don't have a clear answer to that. Obviously, I do want to point out that, by the time you get to 2021 Q1, all of these actually are within the 0 to 10% range. I wanted to keep them on the same scale, and I didn't want to have, too many categories. So I don't have the numbers in front of me to give you a more precise answer than that as to how close to 0 to 10 they are. But they are all in the sort of lowest category of decline, and actually all of the ones that increased are in the lowest category of increase, which is certainly a difference from Q3 and Q4 of 2020. Even by Q3 of 2020, what you can see is that really there's only 3 states that saw our average earnings decline at that point. 3 states that we think of as being relatively heavily reliant on travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation. But I don't have a clear answer other than say I wouldn't make too much of that specific difference because it could be that they're all in the single digits either way, and they could be in the low single digits. To be honest, I wouldn't be able to tell you that off the top of my head.
Okay. The next question is, was 441 included in your 7 3-digit subsectors? I'm specifically interested in 4412, which includes RV and boat dealers that boomed under COVID and support the TNT sector.
No, we didn't look at 441. And so I don't recall off the top of my head what 441, the full sector, is. I could probably look it up real quick. I should have an encyclopedic knowledge of NAICS, but I can't claim that I do. Motor vehicle and parts dealers.
This question is from one of our NAICS gurus, so. Andy
Yes, so I think that's a great question as to what happened with 4412. Since 441 is all motor vehicle and parts dealers, it would be certainly too broad to include all of that in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation. But I can see that we've got boat dealers, RV dealers, motorcycle, ATV dealers. I mean, certainly all of those folks, in an ideal world, we would be including them as well.
Okay, great. So we do have a follow-up to the question, the first question that was asked. And he says that this change in slides problem is a web issue, not content issue. So no worries, it's working now. So that was great. Thank you for following up on that, sir.
Thank you for clarifying, and sorry to hear that.
Okay, next question. How does the census measure workers age 14 and 15?
So a little bit of background on where the data that go into QWI come from. The LEHD is a partnership, or is the result of a partnership between the states and the U.S. Census Bureau. And so there are a number of administrative sources that make their way into the LEHD, particularly for information about the firms, information about workers' earnings, information about the workers' demographic characteristics, for example. All of those can come from different places. But basically, any UI-eligible employment, which is not all employment, right? So, some types of self-employment are excluded, some types of agricultural labor, and so on. But any UI-eligible employment, states have to keep track of who is working for whom and how much did they earn in order to administer those programs. And so that information is what's being provided to us and what's going into this. So we just see the workers, we see what their earnings were. To actually see that they were 14 or 15, we have to get that information from other places, which are going to include the ACS or the Numidant or other types of administrative or survey sources that allow us to identify the specific demographic characteristics of an individual. But essentially 14 and 15-year-olds, to the extent that they're employed in UI-eligible employment, are not being categorized or not being provided or captured any differently than older individuals insofar as they come from the same administrative realm.
Okay. Did average earnings recover above 2019 levels because lower paid workers lost their jobs because wages were increased, or both?
What we see, the two sets of statistics that we see are the number of people who are employed, meaning they report any earnings, and we see the number of the average earnings of those individuals who were employed. So in terms of what we know is that the individuals who remain employed, their average earnings stayed the same or went up, right? And the people who are no longer employed, obviously, they don't contribute to that average. So it has to be the case that, it doesn't have to be the case that any individuals who remained employed saw their earnings go up, right? It could be entirely driven, as you said, by this removal of a big chunk of the employment, right? If all of the low-paid workers lose their jobs and the high-paid workers stay, but their earnings stay the same, the average will go up, right? So that's part of the reason that we're interested in doing this kind of individual level tracking, not just for the people that lose their jobs and switch industries, but for the people that stay behind, to be able to say how much better are you doing than you were doing, before the pandemic, or how much worse are you doing. So I don't have a great answer to that. I also want to point out that there's one third possibility that relates to this, which is hours, right? So average earnings could be, average earnings per hour could be not changing, but average earnings could be going up if, because of a big decline in employment, the people who remain are, for example, working longer hours. So we don't observe hours. In QWI, there is no hours information. We don't observe hours in the administrative data that QWI is being compiled from, except in a few states. And so we don't have any specific information about that at this time. But I think that that's a very good question, and that's certainly part of the motivation for our ongoing research projects.
Okay, great. Lee, could you put the slide back on your address email, please?
Of course.
And
I'll try not to go past it this time.
And then the next question is the data adjusted by age, sex, etc.?
So the data are, these are raw, unadjusted earnings. So when we construct an average, and I apologize that I'm going to switch back away from that slide. When we construct an average for all groups, like the one here, this is a weighted average. So we already had to produce a weighted average in order to aggregate across industries, right? So that we're, considering that some of these industries are a larger component of travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation than others. We're also constructing a weighted average across demographic groups when we aggregate across those demographic groups. So the individual, as you split it up into smaller pieces, smaller demographic groups and so on, there's essentially there's a within and a between component of these averages. So we can think about, like, within the group, what is the average, and how does the overall average affected by the difference within group, and then also the sort of between component as to how. And I apologize, there's helicopters flying over my house. This is Washington, D.C. So I apologize for the noise. But there's also this between component of looking across demographic groups and how much is the overall average being affected by differences across demographic groups. So in terms of thinking about these, you can think about these as being unadjusted averages for that group, and you can also think about the overall average, or any agglomeration or compilation of these, as also being the unadjusted average, because we've taken those weights. Hope that answers the question.
Okay, great. What is the future prediction in 2022?
So as a representative of LAHD, as a research staff, I wouldn't claim to know the answer to that. At a personal level, I don't have access to these data. I haven't looked. I should look at we don't have access to the data from QWI that aren't available yet, that haven't been reported or processed yet. I have not looked at, for example, like CPS or other types of data sources that produce really very quickly, that would allow you to get some semblance of this. But my suspicion is that tracking overall trends in employment and earnings, that probably travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation employment rebounded a little bit in 2021. Is certainly through the first 3 quarters, as the sort of pandemic subsided, as certain types of travel became more widely practiced, and outdoor recreation activities and so on. However, if I had to guess, I would suspect that as of right now, travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation employment is still pretty far below what it was in 2019 and the first quarter of 2020. And how long it will take for that to rebound, I think, is a very good question. And I also think this average earnings question is really a good question for thinking about in the future, because essentially, now again, these data aren't telling us who is leaving, or, what's happening with the people who are leaving employment in travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation, right? They're not included in those average earnings. But if we think a lot of them either left the labor force entirely or switched to other industries, then especially if they left the labor force entirely, what we think of is essentially an increase in inequality associated with this, because it appears that the highest earning individuals are the ones that stayed behind, and lower earning individuals left the industry. So, I think it's a good question as to what that means for the distribution of earnings, and in some sense also just for the method of economic production in this industry or in these industries in the future, right? Are travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation firms going to find ways to substitute away from labor and make do with less employment and fewer workers in a more permanent fashion, which would be consistent with the kind of pattern that we're seeing here? Or are we going to rebound to something that looked very much like it did previously in terms of the structure of employment? I don't have the answer to that question, but I would like to know. So I think that's certainly something that we'll have to keep an eye on going forward. Absolutely.
Okay, great. And the final question that we have this afternoon is, a comparison by employer size would also be interesting. Yes,
it would. We did not do any kind of comparison by employer size, but I believe we can do that. I believe we can stratify that by pulling a new extract while still keeping these same things. Don't quote me on that because I haven't tried it. But that's right. QWI does have some information on employer size, and it wouldn't surprise me to find some amount of heterogeneity on that. Of course, as we all know, the economy in 2020 and in early 2021 was really heavily impacted, but was also heavily impacted by government policy designed to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic, including PPP loans and other things like that. And I think it's an open question and something that's certainly well worth exploring to ask, how did employer size, how did large and small employers behave during the pandemic in terms of, did they retain more employees or lose more employees, comparatively speaking, and what did that mean in terms of the average earnings for folks in those categories? That is something that I would like to take a look at as well. So thank you for that suggestion.
Okay, I don't see any more questions in the chat, so I would just like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to Lee for his outstanding presentation. The LED webinar series will continue again on March 16th, 2022 at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, when Karina Graff presents Spatial Network Effects on Maternal and Child Health, New Insights from Linking Census Data and Vital Record Statistics. Finally, an evaluation will be sent to you following this webinar. We would appreciate it if you took the time to fill this short survey out so that we may better serve you. Again, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and I hope that everyone enjoys the rest of their day.
Thank you, everyone.
That concludes today's conference. Thank you for participating. You may disconnect at this time.